The iron shackles had carved bloody furrows in Sister Agnes's wrists by the time the bidding reached $20. She knelt in Red Valley Junction's auction square, her habit torn and stained with 3 days of hell watching strangers haggle over the right to own her like livestock. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the packed earth. Where so many others had knelt before her, their stories ending in ways she dared not imagine. But it wasn't the physical agony that made her want to scream. It was the sight of little Maria Delgado's terrified face in the crowd. The 8-year-old Apache girl should have been safe at the mission, learning to read and write, playing with the wooden dolls Agnes had carved for her during the long winter evenings, when the desert wind howled through the adobe walls like the voices of the damned. Instead, Maria stood chained to a supply wagon with 7 other Apache children, and their dark eyes reflecting a terror that no child should ever know. They were marked for sale to the same buyers who would claim the nuns another piece of merchandise in Sheriff Holt's twisted marketplace, where human flesh commanded higher prices than cattle or horses. Agnes remembered the day Maria had first come to the mission, clutching her dead mother's necklace and speaking no English. The child had been found wandering the desert after cavalry raiders destroyed her village, one of hundreds of Apache children left orphaned by the territorial government's systematic campaign of extermination disguised as pacification. Over the course of 18 months, Agnes had watched Maria blossom from a traumatized waif into a bright, curious child who could read simple sentences and write her name in both Apache and English. The girl had begun to trust again, to laugh again, to believe that the world might hold something besides violence and loss. Now that trust was being betrayed in the most public and humiliating way possible. 25 for the young one. Marcus Webb's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade, his tobacco-stained finger pointing at Sister Bernadette. The owner of Red Valley Junction's most notorious establishment had already made his intentions clear. Young women brought premium prices from the kind of men who frequented his backroom operations. Despite her infected ankle and 3 days without food, 18-year-old Sister Bernadette still radiated the kind of defiant fury that could burn the world down. Her green eyes blazed with uncompromising hatred as she glared at Webb, and Agnes knew the man would regret his purchase if he actually won the bidding. Bernadette might be young, but she had grown up on the streets of San Francisco before finding sanctuary in the convent, and she knew exactly how to hurt men who thought they could buy her submission. To Agnes's left, Sister Clara wept silently, her gentle hands bound with rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. At 25, Clara was the oldest of the 3 nuns, a trained nurse whose healing skills had saved dozens of Apache children from fever and disease. She had come to the mission from Boston, driven by a calling she described as irresistible, the need to serve those whom society had abandoned. Now Clara faced her own abandonment, betrayed by the very system she had trusted to protect the innocent. Her tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on her face, each drop a small accusation against the God who seemed to have forgotten his servants in their hour of greatest need. Agnes tried to catch Maria's eye to offer some wordless comfort to the child she had failed to protect. But the girl's gaze was fixed on something beyond the crowd, a figure emerging from the desert heat like a phantom conjured from desperation and hope. The Apache warrior materialized from the wavering air as if the desert itself had given him form. His paint horse moved with liquid grace, every step deliberate and controlled. And when he dismounted, the crowd fell silent with the instinctive recognition of a predator in their midst. This was no reservation Apache broken by government rations and missionary zeal. This was something far more dangerous, a free warrior, whose very presence challenged everything the citizens of Red Valley Junction believed about their superiority over the savage tribes. Scars mapped his forearms like a topographical guide to survival, each mark telling a story of violence overcome. A longer scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from some past battle that had failed to kill him but had clearly taught him valuable lessons about the nature of civilized men and their capacity for cruelty. He stood just over 6 feet tall, his long black hair bound with strips of leather that showed honest wear rather than decorative pretense. His clothes marked him as a man caught between world's traditional Apache moccasins and buckskin leggings paired with a cavalry shirt that bore no insignia, suggesting he had taken it from a dead soldier rather than receiving it as a gift. But it was his eyes that made Agnes's breath catch in her throat. Dark as midnight and twice as dangerous, they swept the scene with careful assessment before fixing on Sheriff Holt with the kind of attention a hawk reserves for prey. This was a man who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, and had somehow managed to retain his essential dignity, despite everything they had done to strip it away. The crowd began to mutter nervously as they registered his presence. Hands drifted toward gun belts and knife handles, but something in the stranger's bearing kept them from drawing steel. He radiated the kind of dangerous calm that suggested he was exactly where he chose to be. That this confrontation was not accidental, but carefully planned. "State your business, Redskin." Sheriff Holt called from his wooden platform, his voice carrying the false authority that fooled no one who truly knew him. "We're conducting legal proceedings here, according to territorial law." Agnes studied the sheriff with new eyes, seeing past his badge and official pretensions to the petty tyrant underneath. Abner Holt was a man in his 50s who had built his reputation on being harder than the hard men who populated the frontier. His steel-gray hair was slicked back with pomade that couldn't quite mask the smell of whiskey that clung to him like cologne. But there was something else about Holt that Agnes was only beginning to understand, an intelligence that was genuinely dangerous because it was utterly without moral restraint. This wasn't just another corrupt frontier lawman squeezing bribes from local businesses. This was a man who had recognized that chaos provided opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The stranger's gaze found Agnes among the three chained women, and something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or the wordless understanding that comes when the damned recognize each other. She had heard whispered stories of this man during her months at the mission tales carried by Apache visitors who spoke of a warrior who had survived 3 years in a Colorado prison camp and emerged with his spirit not just unbroken, but somehow refined into something harder and more purposeful than before. $30. Lucien Vega said quietly, producing a leather pouch heavy with coins. The sound of silver clinking together cut through the crowd's murmur like church bells announcing salvation. For all three women. The square erupted in angry voices as the crowd processed the audacity of an Apache bidding on white women. But Agnes saw something else in their reaction, fear masked as outrage. These people knew exactly who Lucien Vega was, and they understood that his presence here was not coincidence, but the culmination of something that had been building for months. "Yeah, now see here." Webb snarled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Lucien's moccasins. "No damn savage has any business. The law is clear." Sheriff Holt interrupted, though his calculating smile suggested he had no intention of allowing a straightforward transaction. "All citizens may participate in legal proceedings, but these women are dangerous criminals who have committed serious crimes against territorial security." Agnes felt her heart sink as she recognized the trap being laid. Holt had no intention of releasing them to anyone. This was all theater designed to extract maximum entertainment from their suffering, while demonstrating his absolute power over life and death in Red Valley Junction. "What crimes?" Lucien asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be lies, piled upon lies. "Arson, for one." Holt replied with theatrical gravity. "They burned down the mission house, destroying territorial property and killing a federal employee. Then there's sedition. They've been spreading Apache propaganda among impressionable children, teaching them to reject the benefits of civilization." The accusations were so perfectly crafted that Agnes almost admired their cynical efficiency. Every charge was designed to justify whatever punishment Holt chose to inflict, while painting the sisters as dangerous radicals who deserved whatever fate awaited them. But the truth was simpler and more horrible. 3 days ago, territorial soldiers had arrived at the mission with orders to collect Apache children for relocation to educational facilities. When Father Martinez had protested that the children were already receiving excellent education at the mission, the soldiers had shot him dead and set fire to the building to cover their crime. Agnes and her fellow sisters had been arrested not for any crime they had committed, but because they had witnessed a murder and could testify about the systematic theft of Apache children. Their public auction was meant to demonstrate that even white women who sympathized with Apache causes could be reduced to property when they threatened the wrong interests. "What do you propose?" Lucien asked, his scarred hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. "A test of worthiness," Holt announced, warming to his performance for the crowd that had gathered to watch the morning's entertainment. "These women are valuable property, and I cannot in good conscience release them to someone who might not be capable of controlling them properly." The sheriff's pause before the final words carried implications that made Agnes's skin crawl. She understood now that this entire charade was designed to humiliate both her and the Apache warrior, to demonstrate the futility of resistance against territorial authority. What kind of test? Lucien pressed, though something in his voice suggested he already knew what was coming. That's when Sheriff Holt made his crucial mistake. Instead of proposing the rigged combat that everyone expected, the sheriff's hunger for spectacle overcame his business sense. He gestured toward the supply wagon, where Maria and the other Apache children waited in chains, their dark eyes reflecting a terror that should have moved any decent person to intervention. "This here Apache girl came from the same nest as your friends," Holt announced, striding over to grab Maria by her hair and drag her forward. The child's scream of pain cut through the morning air like a knife, and Agnes felt something break inside her chest as she watched the man press his blade to the girl's throat. "Maybe we should see how much her life means to a fellow savage." Holt continued, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down Maria's neck like a red tear. "I'll give you the same chance I'd give any animal. Prove you're worthy of what you're trying to claim." The words hit Lucien like a physical blow, and Agnes saw his carefully controlled mask slip for just an instant, revealing pain so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. This man had come seeking information about his missing sister following rumors of Apache children being sold through Red Valley Junction. Now he faced a choice that would define everything, save 3 women he didn't know, or watch a child die for his hesitation. Agnes felt her heart shatter as she understood the trap Holt had laid. The sheriff wasn't just selling prisoners, he was orchestrating a public demonstration of Apache worthlessness, using a child's life as entertainment for his twisted audience. The crowd pressed closer, scenting blood and violence, their faces reflecting the kind of eager anticipation usually reserved for public hangings. "Let her go," Lucien said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that marked Apache warriors in the moment before violence erupted. "This is between you and me." "None $35 says I don't," Holt replied with a grin that revealed teeth yellowed by tobacco and rotted by whiskey. "Unless you can prove you deserve them more than my paying customers here." The challenge was explicit now, and Agnes watched in horror as 5 men stepped forward from the crowd. These weren't the town drunks she might have expected, but hardened killers whose scars marked them as professional violence merchants. She recognized at least 2 of them bounty hunters who had passed through the mission claiming to search for dangerous fugitives, but clearly scouting for vulnerable targets. 5 men, fair combat, Holt announced with the air of a carnival barker introducing the main attraction. "You win. You get the women and the girl. You lose." He pressed the knife deeper, drawing another thin line of blood from Maria's throat that made the child whimper with pain and terror. The rules were designed to ensure that no one could survive such odds, let alone win. But Lucien stepped into the makeshift arena without hesitation, his movement fluid as water finding its level. As he removed his shirt with deliberate care, revealing more scars that told the story of a life lived on the edge of survival, Agnes understood she was looking at a man who had already made peace with death. His torso was a map of violence-survived knife wounds, bullet tracks, and the parallel lines that marked a whipping endured without breaking. But there was something else in the pattern of scars, something that spoke of deliberate torture rather than random violence. This man had been broken by experts and had somehow found a way to reassemble himself into something harder and more dangerous than before. The first attacker came at him with a club studded with railroad spikes, the kind of weapon designed to inflict maximum pain rather than quick death. Lucien sidestepped the swing with cobra quickness and drove his elbow into the man's throat, crushing his windpipe with surgical precision. The attacker dropped to the ground, clutching his throat and making horrible gasping sounds as he slowly suffocated. The crowd gasped, and they had expected a longer show, more suffering before the inevitable end. But this Apache warrior was proving disturbingly efficient at the business of violence. The remaining 4 attackers abandoned any pretense of fairness and rushed him together, clearly hoping that coordinated assault would overwhelm his superior skills. Lucien moved like violence incarnate, rolling beneath a swinging chain, coming up inside a knife thrust, hammering his fist into solar plexus and jaw and kidney with methodical efficiency that spoke of extensive training in the art of killing. But numbers began to tell as the fight continued. A spiked club caught him across the ribs, cracking bone and sending bright flowers of pain blooming across his vision. Brass knuckles opened a cut above his eye that sent blood streaming down his face, temporarily blinding him on one side. Agnes couldn't bear to watch this man die for strangers and a child he'd never met. But neither could she look away from what was arguably the most selfless act she had ever witnessed. This warrior was fighting impossible odds, not for glory or reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of righteousness. Then something broke inside her chest, not despair, but fury pure as molten steel. If this man was willing to die for them, the least she could do was help him live. She kicked dirt into the eyes of the nearest attacker, temporarily blinding him and disrupting his rhythm. Sister Bernadette, inspired by this act of defiance, swung her chain in a wide arc that tangled the legs of another assailant and sent him crashing to the ground. Even gentle Sister Clara found her voice, her prayers rising above the crowd's roar like battle hymns calling down divine intervention. Using the momentary distraction, Lucien grabbed a fallen club and fought back with desperate fury born of 3 years spent in hell. He had survived torture designed to break his spirit, had endured humiliations intended to reduce him to something less than human, and had emerged with one unshakable conviction. He would never kneel again, no matter what the cost. These men represented everything that had destroyed his people. The casual cruelty of a system that treated human beings as problems to be solved with violence. The systematic reduction of complex cultures to simple categories of civilized and savage, the absolute certainty that might made right in all circumstances. The third attacker fell unconscious after a blow to the temple that would leave him permanently damaged. The fourth dropped his weapon and fled when Lucien's club shattered his wrist with a sound like breaking pottery. The fifth and final assailant tried to surrender, but Lucien was beyond hearing words now. Lost in a red haze of violence that would not end until all threats were eliminated. When the club finally stopped rising and falling, 4 men lay unconscious or worse in the dust of Red Valley Junction's town square. Lucien stood swaying in the center of the carnage, blood dripping from a dozen wounds, but alive and victorious. The impossible had happened, and the crowd fell silent as they tried to process what their prejudices insisted couldn't be real. An Apache had defeated 5 white men in fair combat, or as fair as anything ever was in Red Valley Junction. The implications were staggering for people whose entire worldview was built on the assumption of their racial superiority. Sheriff Holt's face was purple with rage, the veins standing out on his forehead like rivers on a geographic map. He still held his knife to Maria's throat, but Agnes could see uncertainty beginning to creep into his expression. The script he had written for this morning's entertainment was not proceeding according to plan. The challenge is won. He finally admitted through gritted teeth, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. But Agnes could see him calculating new angles, searching for ways to salvage something from this humiliating defeat. "Release the girl," Lucien said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just proven his point with violence. Holt hesitated for a long moment, clearly torn between his desire for revenge and his need to maintain the appearance of fair dealing. Finally, he pushed Maria away from him with obvious reluctance, sending the child stumbling toward the three nuns who waited with arms outstretched. Agnes caught the little girl and held her close, feeling the child's heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Maria was trembling violently, whether from fear or shock or simply the overwhelming relief of being alive. But she was safe now, safer than she had been since the soldiers came to the mission. Deputy Owen Clay stepped forward with keys that trembled in his weathered hands, his pale eyes avoiding Lucien's direct gaze. At 31, Clay carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had learned to follow orders without question. But something in his expression suggested that this morning's events had shaken him more than he cared to admit. As the shackles fell away, Pennies rubbed her raw wrists and studied the man who had risked everything for strangers. Blood still seeped from the cuts above his eye and across his ribs, but he stood straight despite what must have been considerable pain. "Why?" she asked quietly, the single word carrying all her confusion and gratitude. Lucien's scarred face revealed nothing for a long moment. But pain flickered behind his dark eyes, like heat lightning on a distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief that had been carefully transformed into purpose. "Because 3 years ago, someone I loved was sold at an auction just like this one," he said simply. "And because no one came for her." The words hit Agnes like a physical blow, revealing the personal agony that had driven this man to challenge impossible odds for the sake of strangers. This wasn't random heroism, but calculated justice, an attempt to prevent others from suffering the fate that had befallen someone he couldn't save. Agnes understood now why Lucien had appeared at exactly the right moment, why his horse had been saddled and ready for flight, why he carried enough silver to outbid the other customers. This rescue had been planned, prepared for, dreamed of during 3 years of searching for someone who might already be dead. "Your sister?" Agnes asked, gently recognizing the particular quality of pain that comes from losing family. Lucien nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head that spoke volumes about emotions he couldn't allow himself to fully experience. "Ayana, 16 years old when they took her. She'd be 19 now if..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Agnes understood that "if" carried the weight of every nightmare that had haunted his sleep for 3 years. As they gathered their meager possessions and prepared to leave Red Valley Junction, Agnes noticed Deputy Clay watching from the jailhouse window. The lawman's hands trembled as he gripped what appeared to be a telegram, and something in his expression suggested that the morning's events had triggered a crisis of conscience that had been building for months. She also noticed that several members of the crowd were following them with their eyes, their faces reflecting the kind of calculation that meant trouble would follow soon. Sheriff Holt might have been forced to honor the results of the combat challenge, but that didn't mean he intended to let them escape his territory alive. But for now, they were free 5 people and a child walking out of Red Valley Junction under their own power instead of in chains. It wasn't much of a victory. But in a world where such victories were rare, Agnes decided it was enough to sustain hope for whatever came next. Little Maria clung to Sister Clara's hand as they walked the child's presence, transforming their desperate flight into something that resembled hope rather than mere survival. Behind them, the town watched them go with a mixture of relief and unease. Problems had a way of returning when you thought they were solved, and everyone understood that this story was far from over. The trail to nowhere wound through red sandstone formations that rose from the desert floor like the petrified bones of ancient giants. Sister Agnes walked beside Lucien's paint horse, while little Maria rode behind him, her small arms wrapped around his waist, with the absolute trust that only children could offer to strangers who had proven themselves worthy of such faith. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape so vast and indifferent that human concerns seemed petty by comparison. But Agnes found strange comfort in that indifference. Whatever happened next would be determined by human choices rather than cosmic justice, and humans could choose to be better than their circumstances required. "Where are we going?" Sister Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The gentle healer's hands still shook from witnessing too much violence in too short a time, and Agnes could see her struggling to reconcile her Christian beliefs with the brutal reality of frontier justice. "Away from here," Lucien replied, scanning the horizon with the careful attention of a man who knew that safety was always temporary on the frontier. His ribs ached where the club had caught him, and his vision still blurred occasionally from the blow to his head. But pain was an old companion, familiar as the scars that mapped his body's history of survival. Sister Bernadette limped along in stubborn silence, her infected ankle sending jolts of agony up her leg with each step. The youngest of the three nuns refused all offers to ride, insisting she could walk despite the fever that made her vision swim and her hands shake. At 18, she possessed the kind of fierce independence that came from growing up on the streets before finding sanctuary in the convent. "They'll follow us," Bernadette said bluntly, jerking her chin back toward Red Valley Junction, where smoke was beginning to rise from what looked like deliberate fires. "Men like that sheriff don't forget public humiliation." "Yes." Lucien agreed grimly, noting the same smoke that suggested hasty preparation for pursuit. "The question is how long we have before they catch up." Maria whispered something in Apache that made Lucien's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Agnes didn't understand the words, but the child's tone carried fear that went far beyond their current predicament. Whatever had happened at the mission before their arrest, it had left deep scars on this little girl's spirit. "What did she say?" Agnes asked gently, noting the way Lucien's knuckles had gone white where he gripped his horse's reins. "She said the bad men took her mother to the caves beneath the earth." Lucien replied, his voice carefully controlled, despite the rage burning behind his eyes. "Where children go to disappear forever." The words sent ice through Agnes's veins, despite the desert heat that was already becoming unbearable. She had always suspected that something sinister lurked beneath Sheriff Holt's surface corruption, but this suggested systematic evil on a scale she had never imagined possible. Underground facilities implied planning investment coordination with other criminal enterprises. This wasn't just a corrupt frontier town squeezing bribes from local businesses. This was part of something larger and infinitely more dangerous. Before anyone could respond to Maria's revelation, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed off canyon walls. Not the random noise of travelers, but the disciplined rhythm of cavalry moving in formation, their approach timed with military precision, rather than the chaotic pursuit of an angry mob. "Down," Lucien hissed, pulling the group behind a tumble of boulders as riders appeared on the canyon rim above them. The blue uniforms and regulation carbines marked them as regular army troops rather than territorial militia, and their precise spacing spoke of veteran soldiers with a specific mission. Agnes counted at least 20 men, all armed with the kind of military equipment that suggested they were prepared for serious combat, rather than simply tracking down escaped prisoners. This level of response meant their escape from Red Valley Junction had triggered alarms that reached far beyond local law enforcement. The lead rider was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that marked him as someone with political connections. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert journey, and he carried himself with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been seriously challenged by anyone below his social station. Colonel James Whitmore studied the canyon floor through field glasses, while his sergeant counted tracks in the sandy wash and their professional competence suggesting this was far from their first manhunt. Agnes felt her blood chill as she realized they were facing soldiers who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. "No, fresh signs, sir," the sergeant reported with military precision. 5 people on foot, including a child. Maybe an hour ahead, moving northwest toward the high country. Excellent. Whitmore replied with satisfaction that made Agnes's skin crawl. Sheriff Holt's telegram was quite specific about their importance to territorial security. These fugitives represent a direct threat to our ongoing operations in the Apache territories. Agnes felt the final piece of the puzzle snap into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't about their escape from Red Valley Junction. This was about something larger and infinitely more sinister. The mission fire, their false accusations, even the public auction had been cover for operations that reached the highest levels of territorial government. 24 soldiers. Lucien whispered, counting blue uniforms as they descended into the canyon with practiced efficiency. Professional cavalry with orders that don't include taking prisoners alive. The implications were staggering. Military involvement meant this trafficking operation had official sanction, or at least official protection. Apache children weren't being stolen by rogue criminals. They were being collected by the territorial government itself under the guise of educational relocation or cultural assimilation. As the patrol spread out to search the canyon floor, Deputy Clay appeared from an unexpected direction, emerging from a side passage that led deeper into the maze of red rock formations. The lawman was leading a string of horses, his face grim with purpose, and something that might have been redemption, seeking expression through desperate action. But there was something else in Clay's weathered features, guilt so profound, it seemed to bow his shoulders and age his face by decades. This wasn't just a man having second thoughts about following orders. This was someone carrying the weight of specific crimes that had finally become unbearable. "They're not here to arrest you," Clay announced without preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. "Colonel Whitmore has authorization to eliminate witnesses to classified operations. You're all marked for execution." The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence, confirming Agnes's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy they had stumbled into. This wasn't random persecution, it was systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten a criminal enterprise that operated under the protection of military authority. "What operations?" Agnes demanded, though she dreaded the answer she knew was coming. Clay's face aged another decade in the space of a heartbeat as he struggled with confession that felt like poison in his throat. "The systematic collection and sale of Apache children," he said finally. 63 in the past 2 years, sold to buyers across Mexico and Central America. The mission fire was meant to destroy the records and eliminate the only witnesses who might ask uncomfortable questions. Maria's small hand found Agnes's, and the nun felt the child's trembling through their joined fingers. This little girl had witnessed the horror firsthand, had seen her friends loaded into wagons like cargo, while trusted authority figures counted payment for human merchandise. The scope of the crime was staggering. Not just kidnapping, but systematic genocide disguised as government policy. Apache children were being removed from their families, not for education or assimilation, but for sale to the highest bidders in a market that treated human beings as luxury commodities. But Lucien's attention was fixed on Deputy Clay, with laser intensity, his scarred hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "You knew," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded Apache vengeance. "You were part of it." "I followed orders," Clay replied without flinching, meeting the Apache warrior's deadly gaze with the resignation of a man who had accepted his fate. "I processed the paperwork, arranged the transfers, kept the records that made it all look legal and proper. I told myself I was protecting my job, my pension, my future. I told myself a lot of lies. The confession hung between them like a blade sharp enough to cut through any possibility of trust or alliance. Agnes could see Lucien calculating the distance between himself and the deputy, weighing the satisfaction of immediate revenge against the practical need for information and resources. "Then why are you here?" Sister Bernadette demanded, her young voice sharp with accusation and the kind of moral clarity that comes from never having been forced to compromise with evil. Clay reached into his pocket with trembling hands and produced a crumpled telegram, the paper worn from repeated reading. His voice broke slightly as he held it out toward them. "Because this morning, I received orders to eliminate my own mother." Agnes took the telegram with numb fingers and read the terse military language that marked Sister Catherine Clay, a 70-year-old nun working at a mission near Tucson, as a security threat requiring immediate termination. The bureaucratic efficiency of the language made the crime even more chilling than explicit threats would have been. "She's been asking questions about missing Apache children." Clay continued, his voice hollow with shame and desperation. "Writing letters to territorial authorities demanding investigations into rumors of systematic kidnapping. So now she's a threat to be eliminated, just like you." The revelation that the trafficking network was prepared to murder elderly nuns who asked inconvenient questions demonstrated the scope of their operations and their absolute ruthlessness in protecting their interests. No one was safe if they posed even a theoretical threat to the enterprise. Before anyone could respond to this horrifying disclosure, gunfire erupted from the canyon entrance behind them. Colonel Whitmore's soldiers had found their trail and were advancing with military precision, and their shots carefully aimed to drive the fugitives deeper into the canyon rather than kill them immediately. But the soldiers weren't the only threat pursuing them. A new dust cloud on the southern horizon announced the arrival of civilian contractors, professional manhunters, who specialized in making problems disappear without leaving evidence that might embarrass their government sponsors. "Bounty hunters," Clay said grimly, recognizing the distinctive riding formation of Dutch Morrison's crew. "Professional killers hired to clean up loose ends that the military can't handle officially." Agnes felt the noose tightening around them as she realized they were caught between two different kinds of killers, both working toward the same goal, but operating under different rules of engagement. The soldiers would try to take them alive for interrogation, while the bounty hunters would simply shoot them down and claim they resisted arrest. As they fled deeper into the maze of red rock canyons, following game trails that wound between towering spires of stone, Agnes tried to process the magnitude of what they faced. They weren't just running from corrupt law enforcement. They were fleeing from a machine designed to consume anyone who threatened its operation. The sound of pursuit grew closer as they climbed toward the high country where thin air and treacherous terrain might give them some advantage over their well-equipped but less experienced enemies. Maria had grown quiet again, her small face set with the kind of stoic endurance that no child should ever need to develop. "There's something else," Clay said reluctantly as they paused to rest in a narrow defile that offered temporary concealment from their pursuers. "About your sister Lucien." The Apache warrior's rifle was in his hands before Clay finished speaking, the barrel trained on the deputy's chest with rock-steady precision. Agnes could see murder in Lucien's dark eyes. She understood that only the presence of women and a child was preventing immediate execution. "What about Ayanna?" Lucien demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the kind of threat that made the desert itself seem to hold its breath. "She wasn't taken by raiders like you thought." Clay admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of confession that felt like tearing out his own heart. "She was collected by territorial forces operating under official orders and sold through legitimate government channels. He paused, struggling with words that tasted like poison. "I processed the paperwork myself." The revelation hit Lucien like a physical blow, staggering him backward as 3 years of carefully constructed assumptions crumbled into dust. He had searched for raiders, for kidnappers, for anyone who might have taken his 16-year-old sister from their village while he was hunting in the mountains. He had never imagined that her disappearance was part of a systematic operation conducted under the banner of territorial security. For 3 years, he had followed false trails and chased phantom enemies, while the real criminals operated with government protection. His sister hadn't been kidnapped by lawless men. She had been legally collected and officially sold like a piece of military surplus. Where? He demanded, his voice deadly quiet but carrying the promise of vengeance that would not be denied. Colonel Whitmore's private estate near Tucson. Clay replied, the words coming out in a rush, as if speed might somehow lessen their impact. She's not just a victim, she's his personal property kept as a symbol of his power over the Apache people. A living trophy of successful pacification operations. Agnes watched Lucien's face transform as rage and hope warred for dominance in his expression. This revelation changed everything, not just their chances of survival, but the very nature of their struggle. They weren't just fighting for their own lives anymore, but for justice that had been 3 years in the making. But their reunion would have to wait. The sound of approaching boots echoed off canyon walls as professional soldiers closed in with methodical precision. Behind them, Dutch Morrison's bounty hunters scaled the cliff faces, like human spiders cutting off potential escape routes with the efficiency that came from years of hunting desperate people through impossible terrain. The old mining complex. Clay said urgently, pointing toward a narrow trail that led up the mountain face through terrain so treacherous that horses couldn't follow. Abandoned silver workings about 5 miles ahead. Defensible position, multiple escape routes if we can reach it. As they climbed toward uncertain sanctuary, following a trail so narrow that one misstep would send them tumbling hundreds of feet to the rocks below, Agnes carried Maria, while the child whispered Apache prayers that sounded more like curses against their enemies. The little girl's weight seemed insignificant compared to the burden of knowledge they all carried, the understanding that they were fleeing from evil so systematic and well protected that exposing it might be impossible. Behind them, the combined forces of territorial authority and hired killers closed in like the jaws of a massive trap. The soldiers moved with military precision, using hand signals and coordinated advances that spoke of extensive training in hunting human prey through difficult terrain. The bounty hunters operated with different tactics, but equal efficiency, spreading out to cover escape routes, while their leaders studied the mountain face through field glasses. Dutch Morrison was a legend in the bounty hunting community, a man whose reputation was built on never failing to deliver his targets to whoever was paying the fees. His scarred face bore witness to decades of violence, and his cold blue eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that made him far more dangerous than simple thugs, motivated only by greed. They're coordinating their approach, Lucien observed, pausing to study their pursuers' movements from a concealed position behind a boulder. Military precision from the soldiers' hunter's instincts from Morrison's crew. They're driving us toward the mining complex like wolves herding deer toward a cliff. Agnes felt ice water replace the blood in her veins as she understood the implication. Their escape route wasn't taking them toward safety, it was leading them into a carefully prepared killing ground where their enemies could eliminate them without witnesses or inconvenient questions about jurisdiction. It's a trap. She breathed, watching as additional riders appeared on distant ridges, their positions carefully chosen to cut off alternative routes. They know where we're going. Of course they do, Clay replied bitterly. I helped them plan operations like this dozens of times. The mining complex isn't abandoned. It's a processing station for the trafficking network. We're walking into the heart of their operation. The revelation that their intended sanctuary was actually the enemy's stronghold should have been devastating. But Agnes found herself calculating new possibilities instead of surrendering to despair. If the mining complex was a processing station, it would contain evidence of the network's crimes. More importantly, it might contain other victims who could be freed if they could somehow turn the trap to their advantage. How many people? She asked Clay, her mind racing through tactical possibilities that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Guards, administrators, maybe 20 armed men total. Clay replied, understanding immediately what she was contemplating. But they'll have reinforcements available, and the complex is designed to contain people, not protect them from attack. Sister Bernadette had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement rather than fear. Despite her infected ankle and religious vows, the youngest nun was discovering that she had a talent for violence when the cause was just. 20 guards against professional soldiers and bounty hunters, she said thoughtfully. Sounds like they might be too busy fighting each other to worry about us. Lucien studied the young woman with new respect, recognizing a tactical mind that could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. You're suggesting we let them destroy each other while we accomplish our own objectives. I'm suggesting we give them reasons to fight each other. Bernadette replied with a grin that was distinctly predatory. Men like that don't trust anyone, especially when there's money involved. All we need to do is convince each group that the other is trying to claim the entire reward. The plan that emerged from their desperate conference was audacious enough to work precisely because it was so unexpected. Instead of trying to avoid the trap, they would spring it deliberately, while sowing confusion among their enemies. Clay's knowledge of the network's operations would help them identify key targets, while Lucien's combat skills and the sisters' unexpected resourcefulness would create the chaos needed for success. But first they had to reach the mining complex alive, and their pursuers were closing in with every passing minute. The abandoned silver mine, perched on the mountainside, like a wound that refused to heal its buildings, scattered across terraced levels that had been carved from the living rock by men desperate enough to dig for wealth in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Empty structures clustered around the main shaft, and their weathered boards gray as old bones in the afternoon light. But it wasn't the desolation that made Agnes's breath catch in her throat. It was the evidence of recent occupation that contradicted everything they had been told about this place. Fresh tire tracks in the courtyard, supply crates stacked near loading platforms, and most damning of all, a series of iron cages that could only have one purpose. This isn't just a hideout, she breathed, studying the horrifying scene that spread out below them. It's a processing center for human trafficking. Sister Clara examined the cages with the careful attention of someone who understood suffering intimately. Her healing instincts cataloging evidence of systematic cruelty. Children were kept here, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Recently. The straw is fresh, and there are marks on the walls where they tried to scratch messages. The scratches were heartbreaking in their simplicity. Names, ages, pleas for help written in different languages by children who had been reduced to inventory in a business that treated human beings as commodities to be processed and shipped like any other merchandise. Maria had gone very still in Agnes's arms, her dark eyes fixed on something that only she could see. Whatever horrors this place had witnessed, the child recognized them with the terrible clarity that comes from personal experience. Her small body trembled with memories that no 8-year-old should carry. How many? Lucien asked, though his voice suggested he dreaded the answer that was surely coming. Dozens. Clay replied, examining shipping manifests that had been left scattered around the mining office. Children collected from missions reservations and isolated settlements, processed here before shipment to buyers across the borderlands. The documents told a story of systematic evil that reached far beyond anything they had imagined possible. Not just random kidnapping, but a coordinated network that had operated for years under the protection of territorial authority. Apache children, Mexican refugees, even white orphans, whose disappearance wouldn't be investigated, all reduced to entries in ledger books that tracked them like livestock. But their examination of the evidence was interrupted by the sound of approaching cavalry the disciplined rhythm of hoofbeats announcing that Colonel Whitmore's forces had reached the base of the mountain and were beginning their assault on the mining complex. Defensive positions. Lucien ordered distributing weapons that had been stockpiled at the site among their small group. "Clay, how long before they reach us?" 20 minutes, maybe 30 if we're lucky." The deputy replied, checking his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to kill professionally. "But there's something else you need to know about this place. Whitmore isn't just running a trafficking operation, he's preparing to expand it nationwide." Agnes felt her blood turn to ice as she understood the implications of what Clay was suggesting. The mining complex wasn't just a regional processing center, it was a prototype for a system that could be replicated across the American frontier, turning the systematic theft of children into a national industry. The territorial governor has authorized the creation of pacification centers throughout the Southwest. Clay continued, his voice hollow with the weight of crimes he had helped facilitate. Legal kidnapping under the guise of cultural education with military protection. For operations that generate substantial revenue for territorial development. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Not just individual criminals seeking profit, but government officials planning to institutionalize human trafficking as a tool of westward expansion. Apache children would be collected not for adoption or education, but for sale to buyers who valued exotic servants and entertainers. "We need to get word out," Agnes said urgently, understanding that their survival was meaningless if this network was allowed to expand. "People need to know what's happening. First, we need to survive." Sister Bernadette replied grimly, taking position behind a pile of mining debris with the rifle Clay had given her. Despite her youth and religious vows, she handled the weapon with disturbing competence that spoke of knowledge acquired through necessity rather than choice. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the enemy forces completed their encirclement of the mining complex. 60 armed men, representing both military authority and private enterprise, all focused on eliminating 5 fugitives and a child who had seen too much and survived too long. But the defenders had prepared surprises that their enemies couldn't anticipate. The mining complex was riddled with tunnels and passages that offered concealment and alternative routes, while the scattered buildings provided cover for defenders who knew how to use terrain to their advantage. More importantly, they had something their enemies lacked: absolute commitment to a cause that transcended personal survival. They weren't just fighting for their own lives, but for justice that had been denied to dozens of children who had passed through this place on their way to fates worse than death. The attack began with precision that spoke of military training and superior numbers. Colonel Whitmore's cavalry charged up the main trail while Dutch Morrison's bounty hunters scaled the cliff faces with the efficiency that came from years of hunting desperate people through impossible terrain. But the defenders had studied their enemy's approach and prepared accordingly. Lucien met the first wave with rifle fire that was surgical in its precision, each shot carefully placed to maximize damage, while conserving ammunition that was precious beyond measure. Beside him, Sister Agnes discovered she had an unexpected talent for violence when the safety of children was at stake. The gentle nun who had spent years teaching Apache children to read now found herself calculating trajectories and leading targets with the cold efficiency of a trained marksman. She told herself it was necessary that protecting the innocent justified any action. But part of her mourned the loss of innocence that came with taking human life. But there were too many enemies, and they kept coming with the relentless persistence of men who knew failure meant court-martial bankruptcy or worse. The defenders were pushed back steadily, their ammunition running dangerously low as professional killers closed in from multiple directions. That's when Maria Delgado proved she was far more than just a traumatized child seeking protection. During the chaos of battle, she slipped away from the main conflict and into the mine tunnels, following passages that led deep into the mountain's heart. Her small size allowed her to navigate spaces that would trap adults, and her intimate knowledge of the complex's layout, gained through previous captivity, guided her toward a discovery that would change the course of the fight. In the deepest chamber of the mine behind walls that had been recently reinforced with steel and concrete, Maria found something that made her child's mind reel with understanding and fury. Not just evidence of the network's crimes, but its victims, dozens of Apache children who had been kept alive as breeding stock for future sales. The conditions were horrific beyond description. Children as young as 5 were chained to walls in chambers that reeked of human waste and despair. Many showed signs of systematic abuse, while others had retreated so far into themselves that they no longer responded to external stimuli. But among the victims, barely recognizable after 3 years of captivity and abuse, was a young woman whose bearing and scars marked her as someone who had refused to be broken despite everything they had done to her. This was Lucien Vega, and she had not simply survived her ordeal, she had become the unofficial leader of the captive children, organizing them, protecting them, and planning for the day when rescue might finally come. When Maria appeared with news of her brother's presence above, Ayana knew that day had finally arrived. But freeing the children would require more than just opening their prison doors. The mine was rigged with explosives set to collapse at the first sign of law enforcement interference. Colonel Whitmore's final solution was to bury the evidence and everyone who might testify against him. As the battle raged above ground, Maria led Ayana and the other children through passages that connected to the main mine workings. Their emergence into the conflict zone would provide the twist that no one, not even Lucien, had seen coming. The sound of children's voices rising in Apache war cries echoed through the mining complex like the voice of justice itself demanding satisfaction. 36 young survivors, led by a woman who had been transformed by suffering into something harder and more dangerous than her captors could imagine, poured from the mine tunnels with weapons they had improvised from mining tools and their own unbreakable fury. Lucien's face transformed as he saw his sister for the first time in 3 years. Ayana had grown from a frightened 16-year-old into a warrior whose eyes held the kind of hardness that comes from protecting others when no one else would. The siblings fought side by side, their combined skills honed by years of survival against impossible odds. While around them, the tide of battle shifted dramatically. Colonel Whitmore's soldiers found themselves facing not just 5 desperate fugitives, but dozens of Apache children who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The professional killers who had expected an easy manhunt were suddenly confronted with a battle against enemies who knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperate fury of the truly wronged. But Whitmore had one final card to play. As his forces crumbled under the unexpected assault, he triggered the explosives meant to destroy the evidence. The mining complex began to collapse around them, threatening to bury survivors and criminals alike under tons of rock and timber. In that moment of universal chaos, Deputy Clay made the choice that would define the rest of his brief life. Racing toward the detonation controls that Whitmore had abandoned in his flight, Clay managed to redirect the explosion away from the children's escape routes, but not before the blast caught him in its deadly embrace. As dust settled and the shooting stopped, the survivors found themselves facing a new reality. Colonel Whitmore was dead, crushed beneath falling rocks, along with most of his co-conspirators. Dutch Morrison had fled with his remaining men, unwilling to face Apache children armed with mining tools and the fury of the righteous. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Deputy Clay's body lay beneath collapsed timber, his final act of redemption written in his own blood. In his dying moments, he had handed the trafficking network's complete records to Sister Agnes, along with a signed confession that would expose corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. The leather satchel containing years of carefully documented evidence felt impossibly heavy in Agnes's hands as she realized the magnitude of what they now possessed. Names, dates, payments, shipping routes, everything needed to destroy a network that had operated with impunity for years under the protection of government authority. But more importantly, They had rescued 36 children who could testify about their experiences, providing living proof of crimes that bureaucrats and politicians would otherwise dismiss as unsubstantiated allegations. The survivors represented justice in its most fundamental form, and the voices of the innocent finally given power to speak truth against those who had tried to silence them forever. As they prepared to leave the ruined mining complex, Lucien and Ayanna stood together for the first time in 3 years. The sister he had searched for was no longer the girl he remembered. She had been transformed by suffering into something harder, more dangerous, forged by necessity into a weapon against the kind of evil that had consumed their childhood and scattered their people across reservations and graves. "Where do we go from here?" Agnes asked, looking out over a landscape that suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. "North." Ayanna replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had led others through hell and emerged with her essential humanity intact. "To people who will listen to what we have to say. And after that?" She looked at the 36 children who had followed her to freedom, their dark eyes reflecting hope for the first time in months or years. "After that, we make sure this never happens to anyone else's children." The journey north took 3 weeks through country where Apache families had begun to reunite with children thought lost forever. Word of their rescue had spread faster than their physical progress, carried by riders who understood that this story needed to be told, regardless of the political consequences. The evidence they carried had already begun to bear fruit, even before they reached civilization. Territorial authorities, who had been compromised by the network, found themselves facing investigations from federal marshals who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Arrests followed along with the kind of public scrutiny that made continued operation impossible. Sister Agnes testified before congressional committees, her words helping to expose a network that had reached the highest levels of territorial and federal government. The 36 children provided corroborating testimony that painted a picture of systematic evil so comprehensive that even sympathetic politicians found themselves demanding justice. But justice came with a price that would be paid for generations. The children who had been rescued carried scars that would never fully heal memories of abuse and betrayal that would color their entire lives. Some would recover enough to lead normal lives, while others would struggle forever with trauma that had been deliberately inflicted by people they had been taught to trust. Sister Clara established a clinic on the reservation, her healing skills serving anyone who needed them, regardless of their ability to pay or their relationship to the crimes that had brought them together. She never spoke of their ordeal, except to say that sometimes courage was the only medicine that truly mattered in a world that seemed designed to break the innocent. Sister Bernadette recovered from her infection, but walked with a permanent limp that she wore like a badge of honor, earned through resistance to evil. She became a teacher, her sharp tongue and fierce intelligence perfectly suited to educating children who had seen too much of the world's cruelty too soon. Her students loved her because she never talked down to them or pretended that the world was kinder than they knew it to be. Lucien and Ayanna disappeared into the high country with several of the rescued children who had no families to return to their mission, expanding from rescue to prevention. They understood that the trafficking network they had destroyed was only one symptom of a larger disease, the systematic devaluation of Apache life, that made such crimes possible in the first place. Other networks would rise to replace the one they had eliminated. Other predators would emerge to prey on the vulnerable and displaced. But they would be ready for that fight, these survivors who had learned that justice wasn't a gift bestowed by benevolent authorities, but a choice that had to be made again and again by ordinary people willing to risk everything for what was right. Deputy Clay was buried in a small cemetery near the Mexican border, his grave marked by a simple headstone that bore only his name and dates. But Sister Agnes made sure that his story was included in her congressional testimony, ensuring that his final choice would be remembered alongside his earlier failures. Redemption was possible, even for those who had served evil. But it required sacrifice, that most people were unwilling to make. The trafficking network was destroyed, its leaders dead, or imprisoned, its operations scattered to the winds. But other forms of systematic evil would rise to take its place, driven by the same fundamental belief that some lives mattered less than others and could be sacrificed for the convenience or profit of those with power. Maria Delgado grew up to become a teacher herself, working alongside Sister Bernadette to educate Apache children who were learning to navigate a world that remained hostile to their very existence. In her classroom hung a photograph of the 36 survivors, their faces reflecting the kind of strength that could only come from having survived the worst that humanity could inflict and emerging with their essential dignity intact. The desert wind still carried the scent of sage and distant storms, but it also carried something else. With the voices of children learning to read in their own language, learning that they had value beyond what others might pay for them, learning that resistance was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible. And in those voices, the memory of every small victory over systematic evil would echo for generations to come. A reminder that ordinary people could choose to stand against institutional cruelty, and sometimes, just sometimes, actually win. Sister Agnes kept the altar cross she had saved from the mission ruins, its charred wood serving as a tangible reminder of everything they had lost and everything they had managed to save. She never learned to believe in the God the sisters had claimed to serve, but she believed absolutely in what they had represented. The stubborn human conviction that some things, dignity, courage, the protection of the innocent, were worth any price a human being could pay. The last auction had ended not with the fall of tyrants, but with the quiet triumph of the determined. And in that triumph, the memory of 63 children who had been treated as merchandise burned forever aflame against the darkness that seemed always ready to reclaim the world. As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, the survivors understood that their greatest victory had been the simplest. They had chosen to care when caring meant risking everything, and they had refused to surrender even when surrender would have been easier than fighting. The trafficking network was gone, but the people it had served would find other ways to profit from human misery. Evil never truly died. It only changed form and found new servants willing to profit from others' pain. But neither did good, and the survivors of the mining complex stood as living proof that systematic evil could be defeated when ordinary people chose to become extraordinary. In the years that followed, as the rescued children grew into adults who carried both scars and strength from their ordeal, they would tell their own children about the day justice came to the mining complex in the form of 5 desperate fugitives and a little girl who refused to let her friends remain enslaved. The story would change with each telling, as all stories do, but its essential truth would remain constant. The courage was contagious, that ordinary people could choose to stand against systematic evil, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually won. And somewhere in the high country, where Apache families had learned to hide from the kind of predators who wore badges and carried government authorization, Lucien and Ayanna continued their work of protecting the vulnerable from those who would prey upon them. They understood that their war was far from over, that new enemies would emerge to replace the ones they had defeated. But they also understood that they were no longer fighting alone. The rescue of the 36 children had inspired others to action, creating a network of resistance that operated in the shadows, but was growing stronger with each passing year. Teachers who refused to turn over their students to authorities who couldn't be trusted. Doctors who treated Apache children without reporting them to territorial officials. Even some government employees who quietly sabotaged operations they knew to be criminal. The last auction had ended, but the work of justice would continue for as long as there were people willing to choose right over convenience, courage over safety, and hope over despair. And in that work, the memory of everyone who had suffered and died in places like the mining complex would find its ultimate meaning not as victims to be mourned, but as inspiration for those who came after, to do better, to be better, to choose better. The desert night was falling, bringing blessed relief from the heat, but also new dangers for those who moved through landscape that was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. But for the first time in years, the darkness held more hope than fear for the Apache children who were learning that their lives had value beyond what others might pay for them, and that perhaps was miracle enough for any lifetime. And the simple recognition that every human being possessed dignity that could not be bought, sold, or stolen, no matter how powerful their enemies or how dark the circumstances they faced. In that recognition lay the seed of all justice, all courage, all hope for a future where children could grow up without fear of being reduced to merchandise in someone else's marketplace. The last auction was over, but the first day of freedom had only just begun.